question today: did the Russians steal NATO or US nuclear codes in 1983 and 1984? And if so, what could they have done with them? Well, there's strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that they had their hands on a lot of very sensitive nuclear and cryptographic material. The testimony that we know of comes from a member of the Clyde Conrad spy ring. You probably don't know who Clyde Conrad was. He was an army sergeant in Germany during this time. The Hungarians had recruited him to spy. Why? Money. They paid him a lot of money, and the Hungarians would take what he gave them, sell some of it to the East Germans and some of it to the KGB. But Clyde Conrad built an incredibly destructive spy ring. The ring was able to give Russians access to all of NATO's war plans for Central Europe, which meant that the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact countries, had they attacked, could have fairly easily countered anything conventional that NATO might have done. One of Conrad's disciples was a guy named Roderick Ramsey, another army sergeant, who was a top secret document custodian, which gave him access to, well, all the top secret documents that the, for example, 7th Infantry Division had. That's where he worked for a period of time. Not only, though, did he have access to all the top secret documents, many of which he took and file copied on his behalf, documents that included electronic warfare planning, defense plans for Europe, secret air refueling plans, mobilization plans, every type of war plan that you can imagine. Roderick Ramsey stole, gave to Clyde Conrad, who passed it to the Hungarians, who passed a lot of it on to the KGB. Here's the really scary part. So 1983 or 1984, Ramsey starts to make friends with folks right down the hall from him, with the emergency actions controllers, who worked out of a nearby sealed office that even he wasn't allowed into. Now, the EA guys trusted him because he was the top secret document custodian, and they were the custodians of all the special nuclear coding materials. They figured that they could trust him because they had been given positions of trust and vetted very significantly. And over time, he got to know them, and he expressed a fascination, as we all would, with what happens inside that sealed shack. And the EA controllers, to their detriment and against operational security, showed him. They said, we can trust you. Come in. We'll show you how things work. They told him, for example, that the safes that held all of the authenticator systems, all of the biscuits and cookies and codes for all of NATO's nuclear weapons, or at least the nuclear weapons that they controlled, for example, the nuclear mines and nuclear satchels and artillery, the nuclear artillery codes for much of central Germany, including the Fulda Gap, which basically would be the place where, if East Germans and the Warsaw Pact were going to invade, they would barrel right through the Fulda Gap because it wasn't filled with deciduous trees. You could get tanks in there. It's where Napoleon fled. Extremely important strategic corridor. So they controlled, again, the nuclear landmines, the codes to unlock the nuclear artillery shells, and the satchels that Special Operations Commandos would get to parachute into West Germany on a self-immolating omnicide mission if that had come to pass. One of the things they told Roderick Ramsey was, the codes for the safes, because look, if we get an order to launch nuclear weapons, to transmit them on from Washington or from NATO headquarters, we don't want to fumble around with locks. So what we do is we keep the locks basically one tick away from opening for both of the safes. It's kind of, hey, you could trust us, and it's a way for us to decrease the time it takes for us to get into these safes. Even though both of them had separate combinations, which was part of the two-person rule that governed all nuclear and cryptographic related information. So, of course, Ramsey, who's a spy, intuits all this. Over time, he gets these emergency actions controllers to let him watch over the EAC, the Emergency Action Center, while they go out and take a smoke break. And what does he do when he has unfettered access to the emergency actions rooms at the 7th Infantry Division inside Germany? He steals stuff. So here's what he says he did. He goes into the EAC, the Emergency Actions Center, and he ticks both of the codes on both of the safes, opens them up, and steals stuff, including the holiest of holies, 2 sealed authenticator systems, cookies, basically, things that are still in use today. They look like credit cards, but they're a little thicker. You crack them open, and inside there are a series of numbers. Some of those numbers are what's called PAL unlock codes, permissive action links. They are essentially at this stage, they were beer can sized devices attached to nuclear weapons that in order to actually release the nuclear weapons or make them viable, mate them to their warheads, you had to first unlock the permissive action links. These codes were not stored in the field. They were stored at higher headquarters to prevent people in the field from launching nuclear weapons on their own. It makes sense. But of course, if you have access to these codes, and Roderick Ramsey says he did, then, well, all you would need to know if you wanted to convince, for example, a nuclear artillery commander working in the Fulda Gap to launch a nuclear weapon is to properly format a nuclear release message, which he had, using the proper coding material, which at least for a while he had, and provide the right sequence that was contained within the cookies, which he had. He had at least 2 of them. So that's really scary stuff. The one thing we don't know, after all of this time, is whether the Hungarians, the East Germans, and the Russians, gained access to this specific material, because Clyde Conrad sold some of it to the East Germans, and the East Germans sold some of it back to the KGB. The KGB obviously wanted all of it, but relations between the Stasi and the KGB were never as simple and uncomplicated as you might think. We don't really know if the Russians were able to reverse engineer NATO's nuclear weapons release procedures and use it to, for example, spoof or jam up the system, which, if they had done, would have rendered NATO impotent in the advent of a war. However, in the book, The Brink, President Reagan and the Nuclear War Scare of 1983, I wasn't going to let you go without giving a plug for the book, but there's a reason why. I developed, over the course of reporting and researching for the book, information which adds a significant new dimension to this question. I'm not going to describe it all now because, frankly, I want you to buy the book. But it includes the eyewitness testimony of the custodian of one of these nuclear artillery brigades in the Fulda Gap. During exercise Able Archer, something very weird and very spooky went wrong with the nuclear release procedures that he was rehearsing. And how it went wrong? Well, let me just say that it lends credence to the idea that not only did at least the East Germans possess nuclear codes that allowed them to exploit certain NATO communication systems, but that they had figured out how to reverse engineer the system in a way that would have been catastrophically destructive had war come. So, long story short, do I think that the Russians, collectively, maybe the Warsaw Pact, had access to American nuclear codes in 1983 and 1984? I think they did. Anyway, that's today's Brink Q&A. There will be more as we go along. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any specific questions about the Cold War, about nuclear espionage, about secrets, about how the football works, email me, tweet me, send them my way. I'm on Twitter at Mark Ambinder. Probably the best way to reach me. You can email me at markjambinder@gmail.com. If you'd like to buy the book, SimonandSchuster.com, Barnes & Nobles, Amazon. Just search for The Brink Ambinder. You can pre-order today. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time on The Brink Q&A.